Greetings and welcome to yet another of Adirondack Wilderness Advocates video presentations. I'm excited about this one in particular. We'll be talking with the Adirondack Land Trust. I am Pete Nelson. I'm the chair of the board of Adirondack Wilderness Advocates. I'm joined by my board colleague and friend, Kayla White, and two of the staff members of the Adirondack Land Trust, Communications Director, Connie Prickett. Hi, Connie, how are you?
Hello.
And Director of Conservation, Jage. Chris, how are you?
Fine. Good to see you guys.
Great. I'm especially excited about this because of what the Land Trust does. Adirondack Wilderness Advocates, as our closest supporters know, does not take issues on private land, or does not take positions on private land issues. We really focus on public land and the advocacy work that we do, which is to protect and expand wilderness and remoteness and all of the beautiful things that we find in this park. But we know, and I think it's very important to say, that the park is a much more complex story than that. And although we don't engage in private land issues, we do note that there's a little bit too much in the park at times of what I call parcel-itis. That is a focus on different pieces in the park. This one is private. This one is public. This one is classified wilderness. This is classified wild forest. And the debates that attend to that don't always work in the interest of the park. The wilderness doesn't care about parcels, right? Ecological integrity and the web that means doesn't care about parcels. Animals and plants don't care about parcels. The Land Trust bridges all of those kinds of things. The Land Trust is interested in preservation and protection, conservation and ecological integrity for the park and land in the park. And so they just play a vital role. And we're so grateful that they're there and part of this story of making this place as important as it is. So, as I said, I'm very excited. I guess I will start with this question, sort of the 30,000-foot view. And it comes as a well-earned question because from time to time, people I talk to who don't know what you do think that you're land barons, right? You're buying a bunch of land, you own a bunch of land. That's the story. A little more complicated than that. I was wondering if you could begin, Connie and Chris, with a little overview. What do you do? And how does that affect what goes on in the park?
Sure. I'll start with this. So that's interesting because it's a huge misperception. We've in our about 40-year history, we've conserved about just over 28,000 acres of land. Of the land that we own and manage, it's 3% of that. It's 900 acres. We have 4 preserves in the park right now. About 2/3 of what we do is actually through conservation easements. And that's private land held privately, and the easements restrict what can be done on there. But so the initial premise there is not exactly accurate.
Sure.
Yeah, so let me expand a little bit on that if I can. So yeah, as the stats bear out. So sometimes we acquire land to hold and manage as a nature preserve and offer recreation, high quality recreational experiences, and use those lands to foster broader support for conservation. So other times we will acquire land on behalf of New York State. We work with them. They're a very close partner. And we will hold it until we can often act more quickly than the state can. And so that's why they like to partner with land trusts like us. So we'll hold it, and then it gets transferred to the constitutionally protected Forever Wild Forest Preserve. And then we also, as Chris said, work in partnership with private landowners to protect forests, clean water. Like you said at the beginning, like the species don't know the boundaries between all of these different land ownerships and political boundaries. And so it's looking at a much broader system here in the Adirondacks and how all these pieces fit together.
Great. A quick follow-up. Chris, you're the director of conservation, and you use the word conservation, and your mission statement has the word conservation. Can you talk a little bit about what that means? I think a lot of people misunderstand or conflate conservation and preservation and other other descriptors that we use. What is conservation to the Adirondack Land Trust?
Sure. And this is, obviously, folks can get into discussions. Well, I think our field's been discussing this for 100 years now, or so. But the way that we look at it, and I like the way that you framed it earlier about, it's really about systems and natural systems, and it's not about parcels or this species, right? It's about how the landscapes are functioning. So when we look at properties that either come to us or properties that we seek out, it's about understanding what's important about that property, what characteristics of it in and of itself, it in context, and how do they get protected. Now, sometimes it's a productive forest, and then there's a timber harvest going on, and that timber, and it's within certain parameters, protecting wetlands and that thing. It's a good place to harvest timber. And so in that case, it's more of the traditional sense of conservation. It is a natural resource, right? An extractive natural resource that is then done in a way that's sustainably used. And maybe one day I'll make a table out of some of the wood that comes off that property. To the other side, you have areas that are so sensitive, boreal bogs, for example, that those require a higher level of protection, what we call conservation values, right? And there you lean a little more towards the preservation side, where you're basically letting the natural systems exist as they would exist unfettered. And so it's really about the property and context is how we do that. So we don't really focus a lot about that distinction between preservation and conservation, but in practice, I guess you could draw a line somewhere in there.
Okay, thank you. Kayla, I don't want
Okay.
to leave you out of the discussion. Maybe turn it over to you for a minute.
No, yeah, sure. I guess one question that we have, and I think it ties really nicely, is that talking about ecological integrity. Can you kind of talk a little bit more about that importance? It's in your mission statement, but about the Adirondack Park. It's a patchwork, right? You have that private land stewardship piece, and how the land trust and private land can work on improving ecological integrity across the park and across various landscapes.
Sure. It's kind of a follow-on of what I was just saying about how when these opportunities come up, we assess them, and if we feel like it fits into one of the categories like Connie was talking about, is it something that should be owned either by us or by the state? Is a conservation easement appropriate? Because what's there on the property? And it's interesting. I've done done conservation work for 25 odd years now, and I cut my teeth in New Jersey. And you want to talk about patchwork? That's a patchwork. The Adirondacks are one large, relatively intact, functioning system. Northern Hartford Forest system that's intact, unlike few on the planet. So it really is. There's different levels of conservation and human settlement and use and that sort of thing. But for the most part, these large systems, these watersheds, are in extremely good condition, relatively speaking. So what we look to do for the most part is like in our water work. We look at this standard rule of thumb about, make sure that, you never have more than 10% impervious cover in a watershed. You start to see in-stream degradation. So, some calibrations, how we look at water, connectivity. While we are the Adirondack Land Trust, our project area, service area actually goes beyond the blue line. So we look at how does this landscape connect to the Tug Hill? How does this landscape connect over to the Green Mountains of Vermont? And those are some valley and agricultural areas that are a lot more fragmented from a habitat perspective. But can there be some areas of natural habitat? A lot of times that's looking at protecting riparian areas along streams to allow for that connectivity of species and interplay of genetic material to ensure that ecological integrity exists on the larger landscape.
Great. Actually, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just gonna add, like, getting back to, I was just thinking about the question, how do we define conservation, and I think, we like to keep forest as forest, like just the basic level. We keep forest as forest and we keep farmland as farmland. And And what Chris was just talking about was reminding me of a really awesome project we just closed on in the fall, which was to protect a 300-acre farm that has about 2 miles of intact shoreline on the Boquet River. And there, the salmon that had not been able to spawn from Lake Champlain up the Boquet River until a dam was removed in 2015, I think it was, they are going all the way up to where these lands are and laying eggs. And it's just like this combination of conservation objectives all coming together in the Boquet River and the Lake Champlain system, and, you know, farm and food and all of that coming together. And that's what we see as the power of conservation.
That's a wonderful thing. That's such a great example, because it speaks right to the idea of, you know, crossing these boundaries in all kinds of ways, not just land boundaries, but boundaries in terms of what the land can be used for and how that affects others. So is it fair to say that when you look at, let's say, a working forest parcel that has sustainable timber harvesting, when you look at putting an easement on that, do you have a methodology for considering ecological integrity factors that might come into play because it is a wildlife corridor or because it's adjacent to a different kind of system? I mean, is there a way that you shape all of that beyond just the boundaries of what you're looking at?
Yes. You know, that being said, we're not complete experts in forestry, right? So we do a combination of lean into some of the tools we have with conservation easements, and a lot of that deals with sort of setbacks and buffers, is that we understand what are the most critical sensitive areas on the property and move the operations away from that. And in some cases, we actually move them a little farther away than you have with, like, you're probably familiar with FSC standards for forest certification. Those are good. We actually go a little more stringent than that because we just feel like that's, you know, from an impact standpoint, from a sedimentation sort of thing, that's the way to go. But for the most part, we're actually relying on standards like that. New York State has best management practices for forest timber harvest. And what's interesting is science has borne out that if you just harvest timber with a plan that's written by a certified forester, that the ecological outcomes are a whole lot better than if you just say, you call up your logger and I say, all right, I need $25,000 out of my woods this year, go get it. Just that difference alone of having a forest management plan that's guided by science and a good, you know, understanding of your forest has tremendous ecological benefits just there.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
and
Can you speak to those ecological benefits, as you know, how it goes and impacts the flora and fauna of that specific area?
Well, it's done in a way that you're not, you know, the classic example is high grading, right? Where you're taking out the best and the straightest and the healthiest species, and you're not looking at maybe, you know, different types of cut regimes where you're understanding how do these trees reduce? So do they, you know, is it rhizomal? Is it through seed dispersion? And so you're harvesting in a way that allows for succession and even some patch development where you have light gaps and you get maybe some understory light dependent species, sort of early successional species that add a little diversity to the stand, and you don't drive it towards monocultures and things like that. It's difficult because obviously the objective for the most part generally is an economic objective, so you're moving towards those more economically dependent species, but it's a balance, but it's better than just, you know, again, not having that forest management plan in place.
great. Anything else on that at the moment, Kayla?
Nope. That's all from me.
It's not up to you. I'm just checking. I had a question when we're talking at this general level that has come up here and there in different discussions that I've been a part of that I would love you to address. Sometimes I hear from folks that one of the concerns they have with the way that land might be protected by easement is that it's not as strong a protection. strong, I guess I'll put in quotes because I'm not sure what it means, but not as strong a protection as forever wild. That is, and Connie, you spoke to, you may acquire a parcel that you're going to have an arrangement with the state. You can move faster, and ultimately it's going to be state land. And of course, forever wild is a worldwide gold standard. It is. What would you say to talking about the idea about how powerful and how in perpetuity easements can protect the land, and is there really an issue about strength here? I've always been skeptical of that. I wonder if you have some comments on that.
Sure. I'll take that. So there's a bit of an apples and oranges here when it comes to the technique versus the outcome. So you're referencing sort of New York's forever wild standard for the Adirondacks is the gold standard. And I'd say that, when you're looking at what governments can do to impose restrictions on the landscape like this in a constitutional amendment, it's pretty strong. If you're talking about legal defensibility, what's the impact to the land, and will this stand up the test of time? I'd argue that conservation easements are equal, if not, maybe a little stronger in certain aspects. But let me first be clear on this: is a conservation easement is a tool, and how you design that tool depends upon the land. So we're talking about Connie was talking about farmland easement. I was talking about a forestry easement. Well, you can have a forever wild easement as well. And these are real property interests. It's not a contract. It's not a handshake. It's an actual real property interest that is perpetual. One thing that's different about, land trusts as a nonprofit is like, the American Heart Association wants to go out of business because they want to cure heart disease, right? We don't go out of business. Our responsibility is forever to hold up these conservation covenants, these whether it's owning land or having these easements. So we have the absolute responsibility to defend these conservation easements every single time they are challenged, and we do, and we go to court. And it's our mandate. When we're land trusts like us, we're professional organizations, and we are accredited. We were lucky that we were just renewed in accreditation as having the highest standards of governance, finance, the way we do our projects, land protection, and stewardship, and that means the defending of these properties. And we have several legal challenges ongoing right now defending these. So it's a bit different, but for the outcomes and the legal defensibility, I would say I would hold up a conservation easement any day, because that's really our bread and butter, is that defense of it.
That's very interesting, and I have to say that full disclosure, I own a 40-acre parcel with a conservation easement. I'm grateful to have it. So, we've talked about some general issues. I wonder if, and Connie already talked about one of these, the 300-acre farmland. It sounds very exciting, all these pieces coming together, as you put it. I was wondering if there are some other purchases or that you'd like to, or land holdings or easements that you might want to talk about a little bit. I know we have one that we're interested in, that everybody else is interested in, and that's the 187-acre magnificent vista off of Adirondack Loj Road. So we'll get to that. But are there some other examples that maybe you could bring forward of what you do and how you do it and how they've been effective? Because that story of the 300 acres was great. What else do you have?
Let's see. I can start with the nature preserves that we have, because I don't know that everybody knows those. And we have one in Westport that like thousands of people, like literally thousands of people visit every year. And we have another one in Wilmington, and I will tie this one in Wilmington to yet another project that is in the queue. So in Wilmington, we have a nature preserve that provides access, like community access from a town park to mountain bike trails that are down the Hardy Road. And on the other side of the Hardy Road, that's where state land is. So let me back up for a sec. You have the town park, you have the Adirondack Land Trust, nature preserve that has mountain bike and walking trails. And then down the road, about 3/4 of a mile, there's two parcels of state land on either side of the Hardy Road that also host a system of trails, purpose-built trails, where the trail, and when I say purpose-built trail, what I mean is the trail is the experience, right? Like you think about trails as a destination from a point A to a point B, but the kind of trails that are at Three Sisters, our nature preserve, and at Hardy Road, that's the experience that you're offering, going through the forest and seeing different features. And anyway, as you go, what direction is that? East. If you go east of Hardy, where the state land is, the Beaver Brook Tract, we own about 600 acres that adjoin that, and we are holding that for transfer to New York State. And that's going to allow now a connection to the town of Jay. And it's going to add, it's going to double, essentially double the amount of state land right there in that area. And it has so many cool features on it. Like when that becomes state land, like it's just going to be so awesome. So that's one that I'm super excited about. And then we have another nature preserve in Harrietstown outside of Saranac Lake that was just in the news this week because we got a $100,000 grant to help us with our vision for wildland accessible trails. And that to me for our projects, I mean, this also ties into the one that you wanted to talk about a little bit more, our property in Lake Placid at the corner of Route 73 and the Adirondack Loj Road. But that's where we see an opportunity here to fill a niche that is not filled in our community. And while we've been learning for planning about for the Harrietstown property, we were surprised to learn that there are not a lot of accessible trails available in our region. Like if you were a person who uses a wheelchair as your primary mobility device, you'd have to drive, you say you lived in Lake Placid, you'd have to drive an hour to Willsboro, or you'd have to drive an hour to Long Lake to John Dillon Park. And there's nowhere close where you can get a wildland experience, right? Like, again, like going back to those purpose-built trails where the trail is the experience. And yeah, it's going to have many destinations along the way. So the potential for that and our role as a land trust, like we have that flexibility to manage lands that way. It's just super exciting to me.
So very quickly, and then I'll go back to you, Kayla. Can you talk just a little bit more about what an accessible trail is like? There's a lot of discussion about trails in the park all the time. I'm on the trail stewardship group. There's a lot of discussion at the state right now about different kinds of trails, what's appropriate or not. So you talked about people with mobility impairments, people who might be in a wheelchair. What does an accessible trail look like to the land trust?
So it has a firm and stable surface. So that means it will probably have a crushed stone top, and it has a gradient that is no higher than 5%. So that would be a side slope and a pitch, going on the trail. So people's abilities are different. Not, people in wheelchairs have different capacities, just like people who can walk have different capacity to walk certain distances. And so the key will be for us, it will be providing accurate descriptions of what is there on the land. So this trail has this much distance, and at such and such a point, it drops down of a gradient of whatever that is, 3%. And so that will allow somebody to know what to expect, right? Like that's the challenge, I think, if you are traveling with somebody who's in a wheelchair, or you are in a wheelchair, like the challenge is to know what to expect when you get there. And we're going to make that very clear, what you can expect when you get to our nature preserves that have accessible trails. And that's what we're saying, an accessible trail, right? But everybody's going to enjoy this trail. Like everyone. It's just going to make it easier to follow. Like there are people who may not feel so comfortable like deep in the woods on a natural surface trail. And a preserve like this, preserves like ours, and the trails that we're proposing, that we're planning to build there, they can be that sort of conduit, right? Like they can give people access to a wildland experience in a way that may be less intimidating than going deep into the High Peaks Wilderness, for instance.
Sure. Just a quick compliment on that. What you said that was so spot on when I put on my diversity initiative hat was that we shouldn't make assumptions about what different abilities are. Some people need to have a range of experiences. If they know what to expect, they can make really good decisions. That's come out in multiple things that I've worked on. You know, the information's useful, and then don't make assumptions. Let people have the experience they want to have, and don't assume what they can or can't do. So that sounds great. I mean, you're involved in a whole lot, but the level of excitement over the 187 acre Adirondack Loj Road property is palpable, and Kayla's one of those who's excited and I know had some questions. So Kayla, I'm going to turn this over to you for a bit. We'd love to hear more about that property.
Sure. And for those who are listening who, don't know, can you go a little bit more into that purchase, go into the details? I feel like a lot of people when they turn onto Adirondack Loj Road, they see that iconic view of the high peaks. They see that open field, but it is more than that. Can you go into kind of it's a large 187 acre purchase? Can you go into some more of those details?
Chris, do you want to take that, or you want me
Sure,
to?
sure.
You take it.
Well, one quick anecdote is that, last fall was the annual conference that Land Trust have. We were in Portland, Oregon. And I'm talking to people from all across the country. And usually, I live in Jay, but I'll say, like, where do you live? I say, I live in Lake Placid. I'm like, oh, I've been to Lake Placid. And I'll say, well, hey, you're driving up to Lake Placid and all of a sudden, like the trees sort of fall away and you have that great view. Like, oh, yeah, yeah. Everybody knows that view. That's why Connie came up. We don't have to call it anything but that view, right? It's that view. It is probably one of the most photographed views in the entire park. So yeah, so we were very fortunate that the landowners approached us several years ago that they wanted to they actually still live next door. They subdivided off that 187 acres for sale so that we could protect that view in perpetuity. And a lot of people say, oh, it's the view. Well, that view is actually, as you said, 30 acres. It's about 30, 35 acres, and the rest of it is forest, albeit that forest is kind of mid-successional forest. It was all, cattle and pig fields. You can still see the barbed wire back in the woods, that sort of thing. But so yeah, we looked at it, and clearly it was wanted to protect it. It's a designated scenic viewshed by the Adirondack Park Agency. Interestingly enough, though, there's no teeth behind that. It's a notable piece of trivia, but there's no regulations to obviously keep it that way. And it was clear that if we protected that property and did like we were talking about one of the properties Connie was talking about, turned it over to the state because of the restrictions on cutting and that sort of thing, that view in 50 years would be gone. So that's how we make our conservation decisions. Like that, keeping that view open has, we talk about conservation value. It's almost like a cultural conservation value. That's how people connect and feel that just visceral, oh my goodness, this is just absolutely amazing. So we can do that as a private entity. And what we want to do is, that property, I said, it's been cattle field, it's been potato fields, it's been an agricultural field, and we do ag protection. But the real importance there isn't so much ag. Actually, these in that context, in that area, is the fact that it's grassland, and we hope to move that species composition from what it is now, not necessarily native, to native warm season grasses and wildflowers. So it'll keep that area beautiful and open, but actually gain some higher ecological function for pollinators, for grassland birds, and that sort of thing. Because we're actually right across the river at Eline Farm and Heaven Hill. There's some other grasslands, and we're talking to the land managers over there to manage this complex together. So the migratory birds, they'll see this as a grassland complex, and and start to breed and thrive in that area. So yeah, it's a neat little piece of property, and we're learning more about it every day.
Oh, that's so awesome. And I feel like you touched on a multiple things that I have more questions about. But mentioning the Adirondack Park Agency and how it is one of 38 scenic vistas. And I loved how it identified it as integral to the park's essence and character. And I love that. Can you kind of expand on the importance of not only protecting, we protect land for the natural resources, but also those intangible characters of, that scenic view, what it means, what it makes you feel. Can you kind of talk about the importance of protecting that, and specifically for this location?
Con.
Nicely done.
I will, yeah, I will give it a try. I think, yeah, the scenic vistas, right, they're mapped and identified by the Adirondack Park Agency for a reason, right? They're the thing that captures our hearts and stay in our memories. You see one and it's a part of you forever. And I guess sometimes it's hard when you think about these intangible things. I don't know, think about like flip it around. Like I could do this in my mind and just to say like, well, how would I feel if it was gone one day, right? Like, oh, there would be countless people whose hearts would be broken if that property on the corner of the Adirondack Loj Road and Route 73 were developed and just lost that openness that allows people to connect to the landscape. Like that. And I think, I would go one step further to say that I think those kinds of connections that people have, they take them with them when they vote, when they're making decisions, right? And that's how you build a constituency of people who care about the environment, who care about the Adirondacks. The views are just as important as any other kind of experience.
Absolutely. Well said, Connie. I know I threw you a philosophical question there. It's my philosophy degree coming back to me. Absolutely. And I think it's really great too, because it's connecting you to the high summits. And I think of, all the time I've spent on the high peaks and protecting it. And I think, being able to drive into Lodge Road and see that view, and it just reminds you every single day, and at least reminds me every day, like why I do this work and the work that I do to protect ecosystems, and so I definitely feel that as well. Yeah, so you had a bunch of botanists come and look at the plants. How exciting. I'm jealous. So you're taking stock of the flora and the fauna. What have you and your team been excited to discover, and also thinking about what it can be? What are you excited to like turn this property into, and like what are you like hoping for a specific bird to come and like nest there? Like would love to hear your thoughts on the ecological side of it.
Come on, grasshopper sparrow. That might be asking too much. But yeah, so we are just in the beginning stages of that. And, Connie was mentioning that we have preserves, and when we own a property and are going to be stewards of it, and are going to do things like open it up to the public and that sort of thing, the first is we got to talk to the land and understand what the land has. And so, yeah, so we've had some of our botanist colleagues come out and do some bio blitzes. We have our stewardship manager, Derek Rogers. He is an expert birder. And so he's cataloging counts, but we just got a grant to invest in some bioacoustic monitoring equipment, where it's essentially like a lot of people these days have the Merlin app on their phone to identify bird species. Well, essentially, this is a scientific instrument that does that 24 hours a day. And we're going to understand what's arriving in the fields, what's arriving in the forests, and to get some sense of that. And when we know what's there and we know some what their habitat requirements are, like, certain woodpecker species like to have a little more dead snags in the area. You know, see, it teaches about how to make sure the property is appropriate for some of the species. And as we shift in the fields and have more native plants in those fields, seeing what responses you hear there, and not just in the birds, but in the insect populations and all of that. Interesting about the field of bioacoustic monitoring is that we learned that frequency occupation, basically making sounds in every level of frequency, is a good proxy for biodiversity in the place you're in. So whether it's amphibians or birds or what have you, we're going to be collecting that data, and hopefully we'll team up with some researchers to do that analysis. I will say the other thing that we're doing is not just in the natural realm, but we're also doing it in the cultural realm. This is one of the first properties that we did a deeper dive into what we're calling cultural due diligence, for lack of a better term. It's standard. You do this kind of stuff. You buy land. It's called real estate due diligence, and you do the surveys and you do the appraisals and you do things like that to understand from a legal standpoint, as land as an economic unit, that due diligence. Well, we've added to that understanding the long histories of properties and what's connected to it. And so, you know, normally you run the legal title back 40, 60 years. We ran it back 150 years. In some properties, we've ran it back older than the county of Essex itself, to find out some of these histories. And that's one lens of it. We're also working with the State Historic Preservation Office to learn what they know. All of this is to say that once we understand the property and where some of the sensitive areas are and less sensitive, then we understand where to put the people, where we can put a parking area, where we can put maybe a bathroom, and where the best way is to locate the trails that'll strike that balance between conservation of the natural areas, but also getting people out there to have that experience, to care about it more. And one thing I'm excited is, you know, of all the places, not only will these trails be accessible, but imagine, like, where do you go in this area to go through a mature wildflower meadow? Not a lot of spots. And this will be one. And that'll be a really different type of experience that we hope to bring to the public.
That just sounds great. And what you just talked about and mentioning before too, that this is really a cultural view too. And it is a culturally significant piece of property. I have 3 questions you may or may not be able to answer. And we'll head toward a wrap up. We've been at it for a while, and I know we focused on this wonderful acquisition. I just want to remind all our wonderful supporters that there are lots of other acquisitions and easements and work that the trust does. So we appreciate that breadth of that scope. On this particular one, you are contiguous with the John Brown Farm and the lands that were part of Garrett Smith's scheme of justice, and indeed the land that you are acquiring here was part. Some of the parcels were part of Garrett Smith's scheme of justice. In terms of talking about connections, are you contemplating any kind of connection so that people can start on your parcel? And yes, the Ausable River is an issue that would have to be, you'd have to have some kind of a solution, but be able to actually physically connect with John Brown's farm. The second part of the question is your kitty corner to a parcel of state land, wild forest, and there is ample reason historically to connect, and much less recreationally. And you're right, it's like a gateway to connect your parcel to the high peaks. It could be done. Is there any discussion of that? And the third one that you probably can't comment on, but having noodled around with the parcels contiguous to this, might there be the possibility of further acquisitions in the area? That's my 3-part question, and you want to pass that to Connie?
I was going to toss that one to Chris.
Oh, okay, well, I'll start. So, well, I will say, starting with, with the Garrett Smith, is that, interestingly enough, and as you said, this property was adjacent to a lot of the Timbuktu settlement, and a piece of a lot. Most of the lot is actually not on our property. It is on the John Brown Farm site, but there was a lot that was deeded to a man by the name of John Briggs. And we don't know the story there, but we are very curious to know and learn if, the story of how either, they use the land, or they, a lot of times, as we're learning, they sold the land to reinvest somewhere else because that land wasn't necessarily the best to throw up a house or start to farm, but to understand that. But that was something that we did uncover. Side note to that, we actually just got a grant to digitize all of the Garrett Smith's holdings in partnership with the Adirondack Park Agency, so that anytime that this will be available to the public, can understand like what lands are connected to those grants, back in the 1800s. So that's something we're excited because it's no longer just looking at those old brown crusty maps and figuring out where the parcels actually were. Your question about connectivity. So in theory, absolutely. We abut Forest Preserve, that abuts the river, that abuts John Brown Farm, that then goes to the Eline Farm that's owned by the Eline Foundation up to Heaven Hill. When John Brown Farm itself and the State Park Service was going through this recent public process to look at a new visitor use plan and all that sort of thing, at the time we hadn't closed, so we didn't say this in the open public meetings, but we did say them privately. There may be some, this property may be being acquired. Unfortunately, we were able to do that. And looking at that area as a larger, both ecological, recreational, and cultural complex. There's the river there is surprisingly incised. There's some pretty steep canyons there. Other areas, there's some wetlands. So there's some logistical issues of actually getting from one side to the other. But from a concept, absolutely be something, it would be, have these places all work together would be great. And as far as like additional acquisitions, we are kind of hemmed in there. I mean, there's roads on two sides. There's Forest Preserve on another, and there's private land on another. So there's actually not, and normally we absolutely like wherever we have a conservation investment, so to speak, we like to compound that. In other preserves where we can expand and really grow and further protect that core, we do. In this property, it just because of its history of settlement in North Elba in that area, it kind of is what it's going to be for the most part. There's some other possible opportunities on the other side of the river, but not on the side that we're on.
Okay. Listen, we're just about at 40 minutes, so we'll wrap this up. But I want to thank you, Connie, and I want to thank you, Chris. This was just a great discussion. We love what you do. We love the obvious, and it was certainly clear in this video cast, the obvious commitment to ecological integrity. And, preserving that is about preserving wilderness in the forest preserve, regardless of the uses and appropriateness of any different piece of land. It just the way that you take that integrated approach, we're glad that you're out there doing what you do. We'll focus on the things that we focus on and think of you as a really valuable ally and partner. So I greatly appreciate your time. I know that our supporters, people who view this, will be very interested in what you've had to say. So my thanks to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well,
And
thank
maybe
you.
if
Right
I
back
could,
at you.
yeah.
All right. Well,
And then maybe if I could do one call to action is that if when people are pulling off to see that beautiful view, making sure they're not just going off and traipsing through the fields, especially since you're doing the ecological inventories and trying to make it all natural and wild. I see that happen quite a bit even before you all bought the property, is people wandering there. So maybe to protect that that ecological integrity that land has and that you're building towards, let's stay off of it until you build some trails.
Thank you.
good. And folks, visit their preserves and follow what the Land Trust is doing. And on behalf of Adirondack Wilderness Advocates and the Land Trust, I will sign off. Thank you so much for watching.